Welcome to Buy Black, the only podcast dedicated to helping you find, connect with, and support Black-owned businesses. We're on a mission to bring consumers and business owners together to ignite the global Black economy. I'm your host, Gerald Jones, and if you're a Black business owner or a socially conscious consumer, you've joined the right community. Ready? Let's get to work. Hello, and welcome back to Buy Black, the only podcast dedicated to helping you connect with Black business owners to find and buy quality products and services. If you were with us earlier this week, I had an incredible interview with Steph Grant, the co-founder of Noirbnb. You can find that episode by typing buyblackpodcast.libsyn.com/002-Noirbnb into your web browser, or if that's a little bit too much, I've included a link in the description for this episode. Just scroll down, click the link, and you'll be able to find it. Today's show is going to expand on one of the topics that Steph covered Monday regarding the history of traveling while Black in the United States and the measures that African Americans had to take in order to move from place to place safely. If you follow the link to Noirbnb, also in the episode description below, you'll find a blog post named Noirbnb and Black Travel, the History of the Green Book. That article provides excellent details about a guide published from 1936 to 1967 called the Negro Motorist Green Book, the Guide to Travel and Vacation, developed and distributed by a New York mailman named Victor Green. I thought the connections between Noirbnb and the Green Book were so fascinating that I wanted to do more research into the challenges facing Black travelers throughout the history of the United States and share what I found with you in this follow-up episode. The information that I found in articles, legislation, and anecdotal stories over the last few days was really eye-opening. I could easily spend a few hours going through all the details with you, but instead, I'm going to try to keep it short, and I'm just going to give you a solid timeline and a sequence of events that I hope you're going to find enlightening and interesting. I've also included a dozen or so links to the source documents in the episode description, so those of you who are as curious as I am can learn more on your own. So let's get started. So the first thing that I want to talk about is something called slave patrols. Back during the time when we did have slavery in the United States, there came a time where a lot of communities across the South started developing these things called slave patrols. They would compel the men in the community to be a part of these patrols, and what they really existed to do was to make sure that slaves who were traveling from place to place without any type of guide or without their master or someone else traveling with them, that those slaves were not breaking the law and that they weren't trying to escape. And so ultimately, what those slave patrols wanted to do was, one, they wanted to prevent runaways, and then also they wanted to prevent slave uprisings, because the number of slaves in the South as compared to the number of free people in the South was so incredibly disparate that it just became natural for the slave owners and other white people in the South to start worrying about whether or not these slaves were going to band together and attempt to either attack or to set themselves free. And of course, as we know, this did happen on small accounts throughout the history of slavery in the United States. So it wasn't an entirely unrealistic concern. So what they did is they developed these slave patrols. Now, these folks, they were not part of the militia for the states. They were armed, but their entire job was to monitor the movements of Black people. And in that job, they had sweeping abilities and rights to stop any slave that they saw, to harass them, to inflict harm on them. And based on their interpretation of whether or not this person was doing something legal, they could beat them, murder them, terrorize them, and they did all of it without any type of judicial oversight. There was no court. There was no due process. It was simply slave patrols out there to make sure that the Black people who were moving around had their papers on them to show who they belonged to, or if you were free, that you could show your papers that you were not a slave, that you did not belong to anybody. And in many cases, even if you were free, if you were moving through the South as a Black person, it was not uncommon for you to get kidnapped, have those papers taken, and then be sold as a slave, even though either you had gained your freedom or you had already lived free. This was one of the earliest forms of policing in the United States, between the slave patrols that would monitor certain areas and then bounty hunters who would go out searching for runaway slaves. These relationships are really what form the foundation of a lot of the roles of police that we would see develop later on in the United States history. And we'll talk about that here soon. So following up the slave patrols, in 1865, obviously the Civil War ended and all the slaves in the United States were supposed to be free. However, in the South, in order to prevent these newly freed black people from doing what the former slave owners expected them to do, which would be either to rise up against them, to attack, or to simply leave, these southern states started developing things called black codes. So between 1865 and 1866, lots of southern states passed these laws called black codes that restricted the freedom of black people and also compelled them to work as sharecroppers. So in those black codes, it basically made it where black people could not go anywhere. They couldn't leave the South. They couldn't move from place to place without still being stopped, being checked, being asked where they were going. And so basically, if you weren't at your house or if you weren't working in the field as a black person in the South, you still were in extreme danger. So in 1866, the federal government actually passed the first Civil Rights Act in order to protect the rights of black people and to disband those black codes, making it illegal for the individual civil rights of black people to be infringed upon by these states' rights. But that didn't really help much. This was also followed up by the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments, all intended to provide freedom and equality to black people in the South. Now, what happened in response to those things was the development of a new group. The Ku Klux Klan was designed in order to fight the Reconstruction era policies that were giving black people their rights, giving them the ability to move from place to place, location to location. And so when the Ku Klux Klan was developed, they basically took the role of the slave patrols. If you were black and you were found on the road, if you were black and you were out at night, if you were black and you were in your home a lot of times, the Ku Klux Klan could come in, raid your house, harm you, harm your family, kill you, rape your family members, do all of these terroristic things with impunity, all under the guise of ensuring safety for the community by keeping tabs on these newly freed slaves. So again, traveling anywhere on the road as a black person in the United States after the Civil War was over was extremely dangerous. This rebellion was so bad that Congress in 1870 and 1871 passed 3 different enforcement acts in order to force the southern states to acquiesce to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so those things were intended to prevent the Klan from dismantling and subverting all of the Reconstruction era policies that the federal government was trying to implement to control the South and to reconstruct everything that had been burned down in the Civil War. So specifically, there were 3 of these enforcement acts. One was the Enforcement Act of May 1870, which prohibited groups from banding together or to go in disguise upon the public highways or upon the premises of another with the intention of violating citizens' constitutional rights. In other words, hey, you can't be a member of the Klan and go out, cover your face, run up and down the roads, and if you find a black person, hurt them. And you can't go on the black people's land and go into their houses and steal them or hurt them. It's illegal for you to do that. Obviously, this didn't have the effect that it wanted because they needed 2 more acts. So in February of 1871 and April of 1871, there were 2 more Reconstruction era enforcement acts that were put into place. The final one actually allowed President Ulysses S. Grant to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and send in federal troops to go into the southern states and force the Klan to acquiesce. And so that was one of the first times that we saw federal troops after the Civil Rights Act go into states in the South in order to protect the civil rights of black people. Now, obviously, this was one of the goals, but the real goal of these enforcement acts was to allow the federal government to complete its Reconstruction efforts and to maintain its federal control. When Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, so did all of that federal support for the civil rights of Black people in the South. So at the end of Reconstruction, we went into an era that was kind of a post-Reconstruction / beginning of Jim Crow era. From 1877 to 1896, states across the South started to develop these new internal laws, very similar to the Black codes that they had developed right after the Civil War. These new laws started being called the Jim Crow laws, and I'm not going to go into all the details about where the name Jim Crow came from. But ultimately, for that 20-year period or 19-year period from 1877 to 1896, conditions became increasingly worse for Black people trying to travel in the United States. Now, 1896 was the year that Jim Crow went from being a practice to basically being law. The Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson upheld those developing Jim Crow policies, and it cemented those policies by introducing the concept of separate but equal. It was after this Supreme Court decision that Jim Crow basically became the law of the land, and it officially ushered in an era that I would like to call a second slavery for Black people in the South. So from 1896 to 1915, states across the South implemented, expanded, and institutionalized the Jim Crow laws. Now, the next interesting period is from 1915 to 1935. There was a lot of change that happened in the country during that time that led to something called the Great Migration. So let me go through a few of the things and set the scene for you and show you what it was about this time period that was really amazing. So one of the first things that happened in 1915, a movie called The Birth of a Nation was released. This was a movie that glorified the Ku Klux Klan, and it was shortly after the release of this movie that the Ku Klux Klan, which had been completely dismantled in Reconstruction, had a huge resurgence. In fact, it was called the first resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. So what we also had during this time was that World War I was fought and won. And during that war, we had a lot of Black soldiers who left the United States, went to Europe, fought valiantly, and then came back in victory only to find that they were not only still segregated, but in a lot of times, they were treated even worse than they had been before they went to war. Because when people would see a proud Black man wearing a military uniform, medals all across his chest, that wasn't the image that was allowed of Black men. Black people weren't allowed to have any pride. And so anyone who demonstrated that was considered to be uppity and needed to be put in his place. So there were a lot of Black soldiers, Black veterans who came back from war and were murdered because they were too proud. So here we have two things in this time. One, Birth of a Nation is released, resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. Two, we have Black soldiers coming back from war and finding that the conditions here in the United States are even worse than they were before they left. And then the next thing that was happening during this time is we had a post-war auto industry boom. So you had a lot of manufacturing that was growing in the North, had a lot of money and opportunity that was coming in the North. And we were just rolling into a time called the Roaring '20s. So all of these factors fueled this Great Migration. During this time from 1915 to about 1935, you had Black families moving from the South to the Northeast, to the Midwest, out West. They were finally mobile and finally had the opportunity to get out from under the thumb of Jim Crow, and they took it. In reality, the Great Migration occurred from 1915 all the way to 1970. I know I can remember talking to my father-in-law. He grew up in a small place called Jones, Mississippi, which doesn't even exist anymore. And him talking about, growing up and you've got your family is sharecropping. There's another family down the road that's sharecropping. You had everybody in this small, same community. And it wasn't uncommon to, go to church one day, see a family, everything looks normal. You go to sleep, you wake up the next morning, and their house is empty, completely deserted. In the middle of the night, they all loaded up everything that they could carry. They got into a truck, they got into a car, and they just started driving north. And during this time, there was a huge, massive exodus of black people from the South into the different areas of the country where they could find more freedom, more opportunity, and more growth. And obviously, on those trips moving north through these dangerous areas under Jim Crow, these families found it difficult to find gas, to find places to sleep, to find places to eat, given that most of the towns that they would have to travel to had whites-only gas stations, whites-only hotel rooms, lodging or boarding, whites-only restaurants. And so if you couldn't find a friendly place to go or a friendly place to stay, it's very likely you just had to keep on driving and hope that you didn't run out of gas. So it was shortly after this when the Green Book that we spoke about earlier went into development. So I'm going to talk about from 1936 to 1970. The Great Migration is continuing, but also what we're starting to see is that as black people are moving north, as they're moving west, and they're finding these jobs, they're finding this opportunity, they're starting to have more disposable income. And black families are starting to travel for recreation, not just for escape. So when black families begin to travel, they're still facing Jim Crow in the South, but they also start to face something called sundown towns in the North and in the South. Now, a sundown town is a place where it's known that if you're black, you don't need to let the sun set on you in this town. If you do, you're not going to make it out alive. Believe it or not, sundown towns still exist here in the United States in 2017. I know a few places in north central Arkansas that still have that policy. Don't let the nighttime hit you in our town. It still exists, but I'm not going to go into all of that. As these black families are traveling, they start to run into situations where they can't stop for gas. They can't stop and get something to eat. They have to sleep in their cars if they're able to sleep at all. And reports of violence against families moving across the nation start getting reported back to groups like the NAACP. And so it was in this era that a mailman named Victor Green in New York had the idea for this Green Book, a listing of all the safe places in New York that a black family would be able to go in order to find lodging, in order to find food, in order to find safe passage. And so he started to develop this book. He's a mailman. He knows the people on his route. And so he started to basically put together a list of all these places that would be friendly to black people. When he published his first book for New York, he started getting feedbacks like, man, we need this for everywhere. We need this across the country. And so what Mr. Green did is that he tapped into his network. He reached out to mailmen across the country and he enlisted them to find out the same information for him. Inquire with the families and the businesses along your route. Find the places that are safe for black travelers and report them back to Victor. And so they did. So he started getting in all of these listings of different locations that black families would be safe to travel, and he put them all together in the Green Book. And so it went nationwide. And one of the best things that happened is it got a huge corporate sponsor. So back then, there was a gas company called Esso, ESSO. You know it as Exxon today. But Esso had black-owned franchises, and they supplied Green Books within those franchises. And they were one of the first major corporations in the U.S. to recognize the economic power that the black community had and the competitive advantage that comes with supporting our people. So as families would go out and hit the road, either for their long journey north or for vacation, they would pick up a Green Book and it would help them find those places where they could sleep, eat, get gas, and avoid danger. The book saved countless lives over the course of the 30-year run. So Victor Green's Green Book continued to be published all the way up until 1967, 3 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed. At that time, by law, black people, black families could effectively travel north, south, east, west without having to face segregation, places where they couldn't stop to eat, to sleep. But still, that didn't end the policy of sundown towns. It just really ended the legal policy of preventing black people from eating in certain restaurants and staying in certain hotels. So let's fast forward about 50 years. Our technology evolves, our culture evolves, we convince ourselves that racism is dead, when in reality we've simply developed a set of laws that force existing racist biases below the surface. Then our advances in technology facilitated the development of an entirely new industry called the sharing economy, which allows people to sidestep the traditional modes of travel and transportation, using online platforms like Uber and Airbnb to connect consumers with service providers directly. The regulations that prevent discrimination by hotels and other established businesses haven't yet been applied to this new economy, and as a result, the continuing racial biases that have plagued this nation from the beginning are back on full display. Now, no doubt, the hatred isn't nearly as widespread or violent as it was during Jim Crow, but it still exists and it's still very dangerous. In 2015, a group of researchers from Harvard conducted a study to identify whether racism was a factor on platforms like Airbnb. What they found was that regardless of almost every possible variable that they tested, Airbnb hosts rejected guests known or presumed to be Black 16% more often than they rejected guests who were known or presumed to be white. And the way that they did this is that they set up profiles on the platform without pictures, and they gave some profiles white-sounding names, and they gave some profiles Black-sounding names, and they set up everything else equally. And they found, regardless of whether the host was male or female, regardless of whether the host had been on the platform for a short period of time, a long period of time, whether they had a large number of reviews or a small number of reviews, whatever those different factors were, there was about a 16% difference between the accept and reject rates of Blacks versus whites, or those presumed to be Black versus those presumed to be white. These findings don't account for situations like the one Steph and his friends experienced, having to face down officers with their guns drawn because a neighbor reported a robbery at the home that they were renting, or the experience about a week ago where a South African woman was pushed down a large flight of stairs by her host for missing her checkout time by a few minutes. Events like these make it clear that not only has racism against people of African descent not ended, but it's also not simply an American problem. It's international. We, African descendants, still need guides and marketplaces to specifically direct us to safe passage as we explore the world. Places where ending discrimination against our people and all people is the priority, not an afterthought. Noirbnb and another company called Inclusive were both born of horrible experiences on Airbnb and carry similar missions to create a safe marketplace for travel. Both were born from the founders' drive to effect social change while solving a problem in the free market. This show was created to do the exact same thing. I love the opportunities I've had to connect with other people who are passionate about accomplishing this goal, achieving true equality for African people through economic independence and access to non-biased businesses, institutions, and organizations. To achieve that, we must continue to build and financially support Black-owned businesses and institutions. So with that in mind, I want to close this episode with some ways that you can start contributing to that goal today. First, you can join the Buy Black Podcast Facebook group, and I've got the link below in our episode description. It's a closed Facebook group, but my intention behind it is to provide another location where people can connect and find the goods and services that they need from Black business owners. So if you want to be a part of the group, it doesn't matter what your race is. The intent in the group is that anyone can come in and share information about their Black-owned business or a Black-owned business that they frequent, or people can come to the group and ask questions. Hey, I'm moving to this area, I'm moving to that location, I'm trying to find this, I'm trying to find that, and be able to find support from other members who will direct them towards those Black-owned businesses. The next thing that you can do is submit your business to be included in the Buy Black Podcast Black-owned business directory. The website and directory are still under construction, but they'll be up soon. There's no initial charge to get your business listed, and all listings on the directory will be free for the first 90 days. The next thing you can do that would really help is to direct business owners in your network to the show and have them contact me to discuss potentially being featured in a future episode. Number 4, almost most obviously, you can spend your money in the businesses that are featured on the show and that are going to be featured in our directory. If you want to know my long-term goal for this Black-owned business directory and this show, I want to replace Google for you. I want buyblackpodcast.com to be the first place that you search when you're looking for a quality product or service. I want the buyblackpodcast.com business directory to be in the front of your mind when you or anyone near you says that they need to solve a problem or buy a product. Am I ambitious? Sure, but I know it's possible with your help. The fifth thing you can do is subscribe to the show and leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher. Yeah, I know, it's just one review. What does it matter? But I'm telling you, it matters. Your one review is very important to me. It really will help us get more exposure, and I appreciate you taking a few seconds to leave us 5 stars. Finally, to help me really start getting this project off the ground, you can talk to 10 of your friends and recommend the show to them. Also, if you're listening to this on a podcast app or at my podcast page, take a second and click on the social media link to your favorite profile and share this episode there as well. Everything that you can do to help put this in front of as many eyes as possible is going to help us be more effective and reach our goals that much more quickly. Well, that's it for today, guys. I hope you found this information interesting and valuable. Monday, I'll be bringing you a strong interview with Nika Brown-Massey. She's the founder and CEO of Innovative Supplies Worldwide Incorporated. Nika has a wealth of knowledge on establishing her company as a veteran-owned business, sourcing artists and graphic designers to be featured on her products, as well as building her team and dealing with the prospect of competition in the marketplace. You won't want to miss this episode. Hey, thanks for joining me today. And if you want to connect with me to talk more about this history, to ask any questions, or give me any direct feedback, I invite you to email me at gjones@buyblackpodcast.com. Be safe, take care of each other, and I'll talk to you next time. Thank you for being part of the Buy Black podcast community. If you've enjoyed today's show, find us in iTunes or Stitcher to leave a 5-star rating and review. Join us next time for another empowering episode. If you're a Black business owner anywhere in the world, I want to help you connect with more of your target customers. To get your business in our online directory and find out if you qualify to be featured on the show, send us an email at connect@buyblackpodcast.com, or you can reach me, Gerald Jones, directly at gjones@buyblackpodcast.com. I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.